Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to head out west to the Lemhi Range in Idaho, to a place called the Texas Mining District near Gilmore.
Oh, very cool.
Now this is an area that saw its first prospectors kind of come through in the 1880s.
Wow.
They were looking for silver, lead, and even a little bit of gold, and we're lucky enough to have some really incredible sources to dig into for this one. We've got a detailed report from the Idaho Geological Survey called History of the Mines in the Texas Mining District.
Okay.
And that was published in 1997. And we're also going to be referencing several years' worth of annual reports from the Idaho Inspector of Mines.
Those IMR reports are fantastic.
They really are. They give us a boots-on-the-ground view of what was happening back then. So, with all that said, are you ready to get our hands dirty and dive into this?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
All right. So the Texas Mining District, what kind of terrain are we talking about here?
Well, picture this. You've got these rugged mountains, and the district itself is characterized by these irregular replacement veins. It's not like a nice, neat layer cake of ore.
Right.
It's more like somebody took a handful of like sprinkles and just kind of threw them randomly into the rock.
So it's dolomite and limestone.
Yeah.
But those veins just kind of like snake through there.
Exactly. And those veins, they're filled with the good stuff, lead, silver, and in some cases, gold.
And that made accessing them pretty difficult, I imagine.
Oh, absolutely. It was a real challenge for those early miners.
So they had to adapt their techniques.
Constantly. And that's what makes this district so fascinating. Each mine had to find its own way to tackle those geological puzzles.
So it's not like a one-size-fits-all approach?
Nope, not at all.
All right, well, let's jump into some specific examples then. What about the Pittsburgh, Idaho mine? I know that was kind of the big player in the district.
It was the largest and most productive, for sure. They were pulling out significant amounts of lead, silver, and gold.
Wow.
And what's interesting about the Pittsburgh, Idaho is its vein structure. It had this relatively flat vein dipping at a much shallower angle than most others in the area.
So how did they get to the ore then?
Well, they started by digging this 300-foot tunnel.
Oh, wow.
But that was just the beginning. Then they sunk a vertical shaft that went down another 600 feet.
600 feet straight down.
Straight down. Can you imagine?
That's deeper than a 50-story building? That's incredible. And this was in the early 1900s, right?
Yep. No giant excavators or fancy drilling rigs back then. This was manpower and some serious engineering.
So they get down there, hit the ore. How are they getting it back up to the surface?
Well, buckets and ropes would have been a nightmare at that depth, so they had to come up with something more efficient.
Yeah, for sure.
The Pittsburgh, Idaho actually had its own 300-foot tramway to transport the ore to the Gilmore and Pittsburgh Railroad.
Oh, the railroad.
Yeah.
Now that's a game changer, right?
Absolutely. Suddenly, they weren't limited by how much they could haul by wagon.
And hauling ore by wagon over those mountain roads for 85 miles, that sounds brutal.
It was a logistical nightmare and super expensive.
Yeah. So that railroad, it must have been a sight for sore eyes, I bet.
It was a pivotal moment for the whole district. But even with the railroad, the Pittsburgh, Idaho mine still faced its share of setbacks. One of the biggest recurring themes in these reports is the danger of fires.
Right. All that timber they used to shore up those tunnels and then all the machinery too.
Yeah.
It seems like a recipe for disaster.
And disaster did strike. In November 1920, a fire ripped through the mine and destroyed their 40-ton mill.
Oh, wow, a 40-ton mill.
Yeah, the reports don't say exactly how long it took to get back up and running, but it must have been a huge setback.
I bet rebuilding something like that back then was no easy feat.
No, it wasn't. And on top of that, they were dealing with water constantly.
Water?
Yeah, the reports mention significant water levels below that 600-foot level. Can you imagine trying to mine for ore when you're constantly fighting back water seeping in from the surrounding rock?
Oh, man. I bet those pumps were working overtime.
You got it. Those mines were like giant interconnected plumbing systems. They had to pump out massive volumes of water just to keep the mines operational.
Water management was almost as important as the mining itself.
Almost. It was definitely a defining factor for all these operations.
Okay, so we've got the Pittsburgh, Idaho, with all its pumps and fires. But there were other mines in the district too, right? What about the Martha mine? I know that one was kind of unique because it focused mainly on gold.
Yeah, the Martha, sometimes called the Alley Mine. It's a really interesting contrast to the Pittsburgh, Idaho. While the Pittsburgh, Idaho was constantly battling water, the Martha was located in what they called a dry ground environment.
Dry ground, so the opposite product.
Exactly. Instead of pumping water out, they actually had to find ways to bring water in to help with their operations.
Wow, that's wild. So instead of giant pumps, they're hauling water in.
Yeah, it really shows you how different the conditions could be from one mine to the next.
That's incredible. It makes you wonder how they even decided where to dig in the first place.
Right. I mean, how do you know what you're going to find until you start digging? And to get that gold out, they were using a 12-horsepower gasoline hoist and a 5-drill compressor.
Gasoline powered. That's pretty advanced for the time.
It was. And later on, they even connected the Martha mine to the Pittsburgh, Idaho via a tunnel.
Wait, a tunnel? What was that all about?
It was called the Transportation Tunnel, and it ended up playing a key role in the development of the whole district. We'll see how as we delve into some of the other mines.
Okay, so we've got the Pittsburgh, Idaho pumping water out, the Martha bringing water in, and they're all connected by this tunnel. It's like a giant underground maze.
It kind of is.
Yeah.
And right next door to Martha, you had the Alley Mine, sometimes called the Andy Mine.
Okay, so what was going on over at the Alley mine?
Well, unlike the Martha, which was focused on gold, the Alley was primarily a silver and lead producer.
Oh, interesting. So kind of back to what the Pittsburgh, Idaho was doing.
Exactly. And the 1915 IMI report actually mentions a significant discovery of gold and silver ore on the 400-foot level of the Alley. It just shows you how rich and diverse the mineral deposits in this area were.
It sounds like they were finding a little bit of everything.
They were, and
Oh, yeah.
each mine had its own story to tell.
Okay, well, speaking of stories, let's talk about the latest out mine. I've heard that one was a bit of a roller coaster.
It was geologically, it was very similar to the Pittsburgh, Idaho, those parallel veins running through the rock, but the latest out was known for producing some of the highest grade ore in the whole district. They were hitting over 33% lead at some points.
Wow, 33% lead. That's incredibly rich.
It was. But like you said, it was a roller coaster ride. They faced their fair share of challenges.
Like what?
Well, remember those fires we talked about?
Yeah, those were a constant threat.
Well, in September of 1920, just a couple of months after the fire at the Pittsburgh, Idaho, the latest out mine was hit hard. Their power plant and hoist were completely destroyed.
Oh no, talk about bad luck. 2 major fires in such a short time.
It really highlights how precarious mining could be back then. But what's amazing is that despite this major setback, the latest out mine was rebuilt and back in operation within a year.
A year. That's some serious dedication.
It speaks volumes about their resilience. And here's another twist. The latest out mine was eventually acquired by the same company that owned the Pittsburgh, Idaho.
Oh wow, so those mining interests were starting to consolidate.
Exactly. It was a trend you saw happening across a lot of industries at that time.
Kind of like a game of Monopoly, with everyone trying to control the most valuable properties.
Exactly. But before we move on, we should at least mention a couple of other mines in the district. The Mountain Boy and the Hilltop mines.
Oh yeah, I was wondering about those. What were they mining?
They were smaller operations than the others we've talked about, but they still contributed to the overall output of the district. They were each playing a part in this big story of mining in the American West.
It's amazing to think about how all these seemingly isolated mines, carved into these rugged mountains, were actually part of something much bigger.
It is. And those connections between the mines, they're crucial to understanding how this whole district functioned.
Well, let's zoom back in on those connections then. We've talked about the fires and the challenges of getting the ore out, but those water issues, they seem to be a recurring theme. Were they a problem for all the mines in the district?
They were a defining factor for all the operations in the Texas district. We've already talked about how the Pittsburgh, Idaho was constantly pumping water out and how the Martha mine had to bring water in, but each mine had to adapt to its own unique set of circumstances.
Right, it wasn't a one-size-fits-all solution.
Exactly. The Pittsburgh, Idaho, with those massive pumps battling those inflows below 600 feet. And then you have the Martha mine using whatever methods they could to maintain enough water for their operations in that dry ground environment.
And then there's the impact of those fires. The September 1920 fire didn't just devastate the latest out mine, it also ripped through the Pittsburgh, Idaho. Those fires weren't just a minor inconvenience. They could bring operations to a standstill.
They were a major disruption and a constant threat.
But even with all those challenges, they still managed to bounce back. It's pretty remarkable.
It is. The latest out mine, for example, was back in operation within a year of that fire. It speaks to their resilience and their determination to keep those mines running.
Well, it sounds like we've covered a lot of ground today, from the massive lead-silver operations of the Pittsburgh, Idaho, to the unique gold-producing Martha mine and everything in between. But there's still so much more to uncover.
Absolutely. We haven't even touched on the impact of the Gilmore and Pittsburgh Railroad and how that transformed the whole district.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. And what about the town of Gilmore itself? What happened to the people who lived and worked in this area?
Those are all great questions, and we'll delve into those and more in the next part of our deep dive into the fascinating world of the Texas mining district.
So we left off talking about the Gilmore and Pittsburgh Railroad. Can you kind of paint a picture of what that meant for these mines?
Oh, it's night and day before the railroad came through. Hauling ore out of there was a logistical nightmare. 85 miles by wagon to the nearest smelter.
Yeah, we touched on that, but I want to dig a little deeper into just how impactful that was. I mean, the IMI reports, they actually mentioned the cost of that hauling, right?
They do, and you can see just how much those costs ate into their profits. The arrival of the Gilmore and Pittsburgh Railroad in 1903, it really changed everything. Not only did it make transportation more efficient, but it also opened up these new possibilities for the whole district, like expansion and development.
It was like that railroad unlocked the potential of these mines. You know what I mean? It's not just about getting the ore out of the ground. It's about getting it to market.
Exactly. And that's where the story of the Texas mining district connects with the broader economic picture of the American West. These weren't just isolated operations. They were supplying raw materials that were fueling the nation's growth.
That's incredible. So we've got these mines, some battling water, others bone dry, all connected by this transportation tunnel. And then the railroad arrives, and suddenly they're linked to the outside world. It's like a puzzle coming together.
It is, and each piece of this puzzle reveals something new about the challenges and innovations of early 20th century mining.
Speaking of innovations, these miners, they were pretty resourceful, weren't they? I mean, digging those shafts, building that tramway, connecting those mines with a tunnel, it's pretty impressive stuff.
Oh, yeah. They were constantly pushing the boundaries of what was possible with the technology of the time. And you can't forget about those pumps they were using to keep the Pittsburgh, Idaho mine dry. I mean, the engineering involved in designing and operating a pumping system at that scale and at that depth, it's really mind-boggling.
And then on the flip side, you've got the Martha mine having to figure out how to bring water in for their operations.
Oh.
Such a contrast.
Totally different problems to solve, but it speaks to their adaptability and their ingenuity.
And those fires, too, we can't forget about those. The IMR reports mention them so often, and it's clear they were a constant threat.
Oh, absolutely. Working underground like that, surrounded by timber and flammable materials with all that machinery, it's a recipe for disaster.
And when those fires did break out, the consequences were severe, right? I mean, lost equipment, halted production. It could even be fatal.
It was serious business, but what's striking is how quickly they bounced back after those fires. Like the latest outmine, for example, they were completely rebuilt and back in operation within a year.
That's incredible. It makes you wonder what life was like for those miners working in those conditions, facing those dangers, day in and day out. They must have been a tough breed.
They were a hardworking bunch, for sure, and they faced real risks to extract those resources. It's important to remember that human element of the story, the grit and determination it took to keep those mines running.
Absolutely. It's easy to get lost in the technical details, but it's those human stories that really bring it all to life.
For sure.
So speaking of human stories, what about Gilmore, the town that sprang up around these mines? What was its fate?
Gilmore, it's a classic example of the boom and bust cycle that so many mining towns experienced when the mines were thriving. Gilmore boomed. It had all the trappings, saloons, hotels, a bustling Main Street, but as the mines declined, so did Gilmore. It's a reminder that the fortunes of these towns were tied to the fate of the mines themselves.
So if there were ever to be a revival of mining in the Texas mining district, could Gilmore see a resurgence as well?
It's possible for sure if those mines were to become economically viable again. It could breathe new life into the town, bring jobs back to the area. But like we've talked about, there are a lot of factors to consider. It's not just about the minerals. It's about the economics, the environmental impact, and the social implications.
Right. It's a complex equation.
It is, but it's also important to remember the legacy of these mines, the role they played in shaping the history and development of the American West.
Yeah.
These mines weren't just holes in the ground. They were engines of economic activity, sources of innovation, and really just incredible examples of human endeavor.
They left behind a physical legacy for sure. Those mine shafts, those tunnels, the remnants of those buildings. But they also left behind a historical legacy. The stories of the people who worked there, the communities that rose and fell with the mines, the impact they had on the nation's growth.
And there's a geological legacy, too. The Texas mining district with those unique formations and diverse mineral deposits. It offers a window into the Earth's history, the processes that have shaped our planet over millions of years.
It's incredible how much we can learn from these seemingly forgotten places. They're like time capsules offering us insights into the past, present, and maybe even the future.
They really are.
And speaking of the future, we've talked about the potential for mining revival. But what about the environmental legacy of these mines? That's got to be a major consideration, right?
It's a crucial consideration. Mining, by its nature, has an impact on the environment, and it's essential to approach any potential revival with a focus on sustainability and responsibility. Modern mining practices have come a long way in minimizing that impact, but it's still something we have to be very mindful of.
We've come a long way from those early days of mining, but the lessons we can learn from those experiences are still relevant today. Those fires, those water challenges, those innovations, they remind us that mining is complex and requires careful planning, technological expertise, and a real understanding of the environmental and social impacts.
I agree, and as we look to the future, those lessons from the past can help us navigate the challenges and the opportunities that lie ahead. The Texas Mining District, with its rich history and its potential for the future, it offers a really compelling case study in the evolving relationship between humans and the resources we extract from the earth.
You know, it's amazing how this one little mining district really reflects those big themes of American history. The westward expansion, the Industrial Revolution, those boom and bust cycles, and even our changing views on the environment.
It really does.
But I want to circle back to the actual mining techniques for a second.
Okay.
We talked about pumps and railroads and all that. But what about getting those metals out of the ore? They weren't just shipping out chunks of rock, right?
No, not exactly.
So you've got this ore with lead and silver, maybe some gold, all mixed in with other stuff. How'd they refine it? Was it some kind of magical alchemy?
It wasn't magic, but it was pretty ingenious, especially for the time. They used a combination of crushing and grinding, and then this process called smelting.
Smelting. Okay, so what is that exactly?
Basically, they'd heat the ore to super high temperatures, and that would separate the metals from everything else. Kind of like melting butter out of cream, but on a way bigger scale.
So they're building these giant furnaces, hauling in all this fuel, creating these intense fires.
Yeah.
It really makes you appreciate just how much work went into getting those metals out.
Oh, yeah, it was a long process, and each step had its own risks. But the payoff was huge. Those refined metals were used in everything you can imagine.
It's like these mines were the backbone of the whole country's industry.
And we talked about those mining companies. That was part of a bigger trend happening across all kinds of industries back then. Bigger companies swallowing up smaller ones to boost their production and control more of the market. It's the same thing we see today.
Economies of scale efficiency, maybe even getting rid of competition.
Exactly. By owning more mines, those big companies could do things cheaper, invest in better equipment, and really have a bigger say in the market.
It's fascinating how those same forces are still at work today. But let's talk about something that's been a big part of this whole story, water. It's both essential for mining and a huge challenge. It seems like every mine had to deal with it in some way.
Water is the defining element here, for sure. We saw how it played out differently at each mine. The Pittsburgh, Idaho, with its constant pumping, the Martha mine having to bring water in, it really shows how water management was just as crucial as any other part of the operation.
Those pumps at the Pittsburgh, Idaho were literally keeping the mine alive. And the Martha mine, with those dry conditions, they had to get creative just to keep things going.
It proves that mining isn't just about digging and hauling. It's about understanding the environment and adapting to it.
And that's a lesson that's still relevant today as we think about the future of mining, especially in places like the Texas Mining District.
Absolutely. Modern mining has a big emphasis on sustainability and protecting the environment. And that means being smart about how we manage water.
It's about finding that balance between getting what we need and protecting the planet for the future.
Exactly. And the lessons we can learn from those early miners, those pioneers who dealt with these challenges firsthand, those lessons can guide us today.
Like their experiences, their innovations, and even their mistakes are all there for us to learn from.
They are, and they can help us create a more sustainable and responsible approach to mining.
Well, I think we've explored just about every corner of the Texas Mining District today. From those crazy veins of ore to those devastating fires to the railroad that connected it all to the rest of the world. It's been a wild ride.
It has, and it just goes to show how these seemingly forgotten places can teach us so much about our history, our ingenuity, and even our connection to the earth.
It reminds us that there are stories hidden everywhere, even in the most unexpected places. And maybe those stories, those whispers from the past, can inspire a new generation of miners who are committed to sustainability and responsibility.
That's a powerful thought, and it highlights how important it is to understand our past as we face the challenges and opportunities of the future.
Well said. I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the heart of the Texas Mining District. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep listening to those whispers from the past. They might just hold the key to a brighter future.